This podcast is brought to you by the Center for Educational Innovation. Since 1989, the CEI has helped shift school systems towards authentic, from-the-ground-up improvement, turning under-resourced schools into engines of opportunity and impact. TeacherGuard thanks you for your proud sponsorship and support. Teaching is hard, and oftentimes it isn't what happens in the classroom that makes the job difficult. It's what happens before and after school, during passing periods, at lunch, in meetings, or in our lives outside of school that challenges our ability to stick with the profession. TeacherGuard is committed to focusing on making teaching sustainable and enjoyable. We want to make the rewards of the profession seem more attainable and the challenges more bearable. Our mentorship model pairs teachers with consistent daily support from a peer educator. Through TeacherGuard's 4 sustainability principles, we will walk the challenging times with you and allow you to enjoy the wins and celebrations that come with this beautiful profession. See teacherguard.net for more information and to explore how you can join our community of educators today. We hope you enjoy today's podcast. To another episode of the TeacherGuard podcast. I am really happy to be joined today by someone who I just met a few months ago, but really excited to chat with you a little bit more after getting to work with you a little bit. Shelley, how are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Let's start off by just having you introduce yourself, a little bit about your background in teaching, what you've done, what you do now. Just anything about yourself.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I started my teaching experience in the Peace Corps in West Africa. Figured if I could like teaching under those circumstances, probably it was a good fit. And then I did some graduate work on ice cores and paleoclimate before I landed independent school here in Seattle.
And I learned recently you had a little detour where you did some substitute teaching somewhere interesting, right?
That's right. I did do some substitute teaching in Norway. And substitute teaching is a whole other ballgame. And so my heart goes out to anyone whose inroad is substitute teaching. Stick to it.
Yeah. So lots of teaching experience across different grade levels, across different countries. You've seen a lot. And so in your experience, what are some things, or one major thing that you see as a challenge for sustainability in teaching, not necessarily just for new teachers, but for anybody in the profession?
Yeah, I think for me when starting out, one of the biggest things was getting out of my own way. As anybody who is coming into the teaching profession with some perfectionist or overachiever attitudes, it can feel incredibly overwhelming. So one of the things I did to help manage that was I like the concept. I'm a very big to-do list person, but a friend of mine and I joked around and made a to-don't list during our first couple years of teaching. Which was a funny way to turn it on its head and just give ourselves credit and stars and flowers for those moments that you actually don't want to happen, but they are kind of funny and every teacher has to experience them. Like that moment where you just didn't have what you needed for the lab that you were halfway through, or realizing that you just had a loose lesson plan and you didn't actually know where all of those 50 minutes were going to go. And just recognizing that all of those things are things that all new teachers have to struggle through, made it more palatable, just to laugh about it.
Curious, what made you come up with that, or how did you and your colleague come up with that idea of a to-don't list?
I think it was her mom is a school counselor, and so I think she just had this habit of flipping things on their heads, and it just became so laughable how long the to-do list was and how you were never actually going to get to any of it. And so just needed a way to uplift and celebrate the fact that we were about to have all sorts of wild experiences that feel deeply uncomfortable.
It's interesting because this is now the third straight conversation that I've had on recent recordings where what comes up has to do with just volume of work, and how the strategies that we have to either overcome that or get overwhelmed by that, really in many cases dictates people's ability or desire to remain in the profession. And so I know you mentioned the to-don't list is something that kind of helped managing that, but what are maybe some other things that you've seen either yourself do or your colleagues uh, to kind of manage that, deciding what to put on your plate?
Deciding what to put on your plate, I think, is a really tricky thing. And I think that one of the biggest things that I had to learn in the first 2 or 3 years of teaching was that this pinnacle of perfection that you see and observe and are taught in your master's in teaching program or certification program is not actually the target for your first year. And that's so hard because most people go into teaching because they have a heart for it and they want to really serve kids well and inspire them. And it is hard to feel like you are not meeting that mark in the first year. But to give an example, I had to get really good at protecting my own boundaries and deciding what to say yes and no to. So, for example, I think it was my second year in teaching, The Martian came out. And if anybody remembers that movie and that book, I started reading that book during my summer break, and I was, trying to wind down for bed and instead having like panic attacks about, I have to put this in my lesson, I have to put that in my lesson. And I just gave myself the out. And I just said, you know what? This is so ripe and I'm going to get it in there, but I just can't right now. And so a year later, I worked it into an end of unit project. And then by 2 years later, it was a full-fledged project-based learning project. And I wasn't used to thinking of teaching and curriculum development as this kind of like 3 to 5 year project, but starting to view it through that lens and being patient with new cool ideas, and honoring them and saying, it's okay that I'm not doing that tomorrow, but I have a cool idea and I'm going to see it through at some point. And an analogy that I like to make is thinking about, your favorite authors who wrote incredible books, right? Your Tolkien's or your Rowling's, or they didn't sit down and write the book from start to finish. They don't start on chapter 1 and know each word and sentence they're going to write. They are writing a snippet here and an anecdote there, and then they're cobbling it together, and it's marvelous, right? After all of that work and massaging. And so shifting gears to think of my work in that dimension really helped move me to be able to say, yes, that's a good idea, and it's not on my plate right now. That's not what I'm focusing on this year or this trimester.
Yeah. I mean, to the disappointment of many people, George R. Martin still hasn't finished, all the Game of Thrones, and they already concluded an entire TV series about it. So that goes to, speaks to patience, right? And it's funny that you bring that up because it is a teacher or principle, this idea of timing your innovation. And I am someone who gets really inspired and excited by something. And just like that, I can get over it real quick if I don't feel like it's taken off quickly enough, or like I've not devoted the amount of attention that I'd like to right away. And that is something that I am working on, and I think would benefit a lot of teachers to work on, the idea of just patience, giving yourself patience and giving yourself grace when trying new things, when adding things to one's plate, so to speak.
Yeah.
And a lot of times I think that then translates to other things with work, right? Patience with thinking maybe about your interactions with your colleagues or your interactions with your superiors or other folks, and the idea of kind of wanting to have folks react to something some idea that we have, to some proposal in a way that is affirmative and positive. And another thing that we talk about a lot with teachers is, you don't know where other people's heads are at any given time. Like that enthusiasm, that excitement, that desire that you have, that whatever it is that you're looking for. Sometimes we need to be really outspoken about it in order to get it, because oftentimes if we think that it will come, other people will see, other people will understand, without me having to do anything above and beyond, then it doesn't happen, and then we get demoralized, and that could affect sustainability. And I believe you have a story worth sharing that kind of relates to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I had, some people land in their perfect school and have amazing collaborative teams and a really awesome administration. And then some people have challenges along the way. And I think that that's more the story for people is learning how to navigate complex interaction with colleagues and complex interaction with administrators. I was relatively lucky and had some great collaborative teams that I worked with. But I did have a challenging interaction with one of my administrators. The topic was standards-based grading, and it was top of mind for a lot of people at the school because we were having lots of conversations and lots of PD around it. And in a moment of frustration, I expressed that in a way that was not well received by one of my administrators. Um, Meanwhile, I felt really misunderstood as one of the few people in the science department that was really trying to adapt standards-based grading and really thinking deeply about how to make sense of it and how to make it work for students. So that miss of me missing my administrator felt really painful. To the point where I almost considered quitting because she was a person at my school that I'd really looked up to. And it just made me deeply uncomfortable to have that sort of tension in my workplace. Of course, I apologized profusely and continued to work with her in the capacity that I could, but it wasn't until a couple years later when I had the opportunity to apply for department chair in my department. And through that process, I was able to just really be persistent in my conversations with her and with this administrator and a team of other folks who were hiring for that position. I had to really reflect on what I had learned from that and think about how that could carry me forward. So perpetually spinning everything towards a growth mindset. And what I found was that I was able to articulate in my interview for department chair, I was able to showcase this challenge and this tension and this experience as a positive thing because I know what it feels like to be a teacher who's navigating complexity with an administrator. And so as I step into an administrator's shoes, I have that in my toolbox as helping me better empathize with a teacher who's having that experience and helping me kind of propel myself forward into how to have those conversations smoothly. So I was able to, in effect, apologize to my administrators through my interview process and showcase how this moment of challenge was actually an asset in the long run, because now I'm someone who knows and understands how to navigate complexity and work on the long-term administrator-teacher relationship and just continue to persist through that.
It sounds like it took a lot of reflection on your end to kind of get to that end point. And I'm wondering, because it really seems like you were at I'm trying to think of the correct word for it, like I could go either way situation, not a breaking point, but a tipping point, let's say. And I am really curious, why do you think, or what do you attribute to as the main reason for why this resulted in such a positive way compared to the potential other outcome, which essentially was you leaving?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think at least one thing that really contributed to it was, and I can't claim any, superhero move here, but I think it's just, I took really small steps towards reconnecting. Um, I had small conversations with her. I circled back to the administrator when I was stepping into a summer position, and I knew I was gonna. I wanted constructive feedback and help on how to step into leadership in a meaningful way. And asking her for resources, she was able to give me some books and resources and guide me. So instead of having one touch point where I was attempting to just make everything better all at once, I let myself sit in the uncertainty and the discomfort but leaned into small, like micro moments of being able to reconnect with her and also show her that I was learning and growing from the conflict that we had.
So it sounds like, some of the reasoning, at least for this positive turnout, was uh, the response from this particular leader, right? Because I can imagine in a different world, you may not get that kind of positive, whether it was positive or not, whatever, kind of supportive type of response. In a different world, maybe there's no tolerance for what you did,
Absolutely.
you know?
And I think at least one part of that is this person's a professional. And if you approach a professional, they are going to collaborate with you. And then the second piece of that is approaching with vulnerability. So, I mean, the proverbial, like if I were a wild animal, I showed my belly, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just made it very clear how much I recognized that I had so much room to grow and that I wanted to grow. And, um, and I think those two things really drive all my conversations forward. That just being willing to say, hey, that was really awful and I'm really sorry about that. And I still have a lot to learn.
Yeah. And there's a bravery in that I think, when thinking about both new and veteran teachers and that idea of vulnerability, for new teachers, sometimes there's fear in being vulnerable, right? Because you're going to be exposed as someone who doesn't have experience, as someone who makes mistakes, which is all a good leader would see that as all natural things that you can work on someone with. But then there's also that fear of vulnerability for a veteran teacher, because at some point, if you didn't acquire that vulnerability or express that early on in your career, what may end up happening is that you become so guarded that you get to a point where, like, I've survived long enough, why after 10 years would I change what I am doing, and open myself up to criticism. So it's funny because you often think about vulnerability as something that new teachers need to learn and get comfortable with. But I'm curious what your thoughts are about, like, this is true for all teachers, and it may be why teachers get into the middle and later points of their career and can at times just kind of say, I'm just going to cruise here. I'm going to lay low. I'm not going to cause any trouble until I get to my retirement.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the other things that really led to my the sustainability in my early years was just my growing awareness of how uplifting it was to be vulnerable with colleagues on a daily basis. And I think what I want to emphasize is the shift from complaining around the water cooler to just surfacing your own tensions and growth areas around the water cooler. And when I shifted into that mindset, what I found was groups of people who were dying to air their own moments of confusion and weakness and hear concerns and ideas from other teachers. So coming back to the office and making a joke about, well, we only spent 60 minutes on graphing. I don't think they learned anything. What do you do? Or have you had this experience before? Or how do I pick myself back up?
Mm,
I
yeah.
feel kind of demoralized right now. And just admit it, having those moments of weakness and honesty about where you're at, it's an opportunity for other teachers to lift you up. And there's a real difference between saying, oh, I think I failed. Like, oh, I just really think I could have done better. than coming in and complaining about students. Gosh, they really just can't get graphing what is wrong with them. And that shift in the conversation fills the teacher's cup.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you bring that up because I think about I am someone who I'm growing more and more aware that oftentimes I hide some of my uncertainties, some of my things I'm uncomfortable with through humor. And the few times that somebody has called me out on it just by saying like, "Oh, what do you mean by that?" Or like, "Say more about that." I It throws me off, right? Because I'm like, no, it's just a joke, like, we don't need to keep talking about this. I don't want to keep talking about it. Um, and there is a lot of that, whether it's, in the lunchroom in between passing periods before and after school. I think a lot of folks, when they want to get something out that's been kind of building up for a while, they do it through cracking a joke or making kind of an exaggerated statement about something. And oftentimes, time gets the best of us, right? Because we can't stop them every time and say, like, let's talk more about that, to your point. Um, but then if that stuff doesn't come out, then it might come out at the wrong moments, right?
Mm,
In a moment where we're angry or, you know, from a science teacher's perspective, when pressure builds up, something's going to happen. The container's got to get bigger or it's going to blow. Um, and I wonder what thinking about your story, if there's maybe other situations where you've seen other folks kind of experience that and just, not time things correctly because we were holding on to that for too long.
yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to think about, I guess the one thing that immediately comes to mind for me is something that we always tell our seniors. I teach mostly seniors at this point. And one thing that we always tell them as they're leaving and heading off towards graduation and potentially college is find your people, right? Um, that's one of the huge things about going off and building your life as a young person. And I think I wish I had been given that advice as a new teacher. Find your people, find your safe space. That you can voice your anxiety and your discomfort and your insecurity and feel uplifted. And I think it's okay to be intentional about that. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
okay to reach out and ask other new teachers or even older teachers and just say, "Hey, I could really use a mentor, and I wonder if you wouldn't mind meeting with me once a month." Yeah, because I think otherwise, like you're saying, it just comes out at the wrong times and in the wrong ways, and in unconstructive ways that kind of tear yourself down or tear other teachers down around you.
And sometimes finding your people gives you that opportunity to almost have a practice run at what does it look like me sharing this discomfort with someone who is not quote my people but maybe needs to be aware of that information because they have some kind of influence over maybe changing the circumstances that are leading me to feel this way. So plenty of times where I have spitballed ideas, vented frustrations with my people. And then that has turned into a very polished way of like, well, now I'm going to go to my principal and share this, right? In a way that has been rehearsed, in a way that maybe has considered what their perspective may be and incorporates it into my pitch. Um, that idea of finding your people is so valuable in so many ways.
Yeah.
Um,
And I literally did that very recently, had a meeting with our head of school about a decision that felt like a really big decision for our department. And I'm stepping into department chair. So, lots of imposter syndrome about who am I to make this decision already.
yeah.
And so I just recognized that I needed to talk it out with somebody first. And so found my people to verbalize that. And then those conversations come across so much better, so much more authentic and articulate, um, and constructive.
Yeah. And that feeling of that imposter syndrome, that's prevalent with many decision makers. And so as a result, oftentimes we think, I have to be perfect in my delivery of this request idea. And then you're in that conversation and you have no idea that that principal, that AP, that whatever, is also thinking like, oh man, I need to have an answer by the end of this conversation, and I don't know what I can and cannot approve, and I got to remain confident so that this person doesn't see me any different. So it's almost like there's anxiety on both ends of the conversation, and yet nobody talks about it. So we're just going to pretend it doesn't exist. We'll all play our parts, and then hopefully we get out of this with some kind of productive outcome. And it would probably be weird if they started a conversation both saying like, hey, we're all a little anxious about this. Like, let's put that out there. But maybe not. Maybe that's what we need a little bit more of, in transparent communication to get us where we want to go.
I do think that there's a really nice, our school read a book 2 or 3 years ago called Onward about setting an intention for the meeting, a purpose, and designating that up front. And I think there's something really nice about naming that. Just naming up front, this is a big decision and maybe we won't make it today, but let's talk out some of the pieces. Or, I'm not sure exactly where we can get to in this meeting, but I just really need a sounding board and I have a couple ideas I want to run past you. And so I think that there's real power in framing a conversation up front like that. And my exiting department chair was so masterful at being vulnerable in those moments and just articulating, I'm not sure how I can help, but I'm here to listen and I'll frame whatever context I can for you and provide any support. So I think a real ask for administrators is to come into those conversations with that empathy and that vulnerability to showcase that. How amazing would those meetings be if everybody just came in saying, we're all a little anxious about this?
Yeah. Yeah, almost like we're all pretending, right? We are all pretending to be more polished and knowledgeable than we actually are, right? And it's
That's right.
okay. And we can get that out of the way, and we can probably get a lot of ego out of the way, and we could probably get a lot farther than we would otherwise.
Yeah.
I'd be remiss if I did not ask you about your various experiences that you've had teaching outside of the United States. And whether it's from a sustainability standpoint or not, I am curious in the experiences that you've had, how the environment affects teachers' ability or desire to teach, both in both of your experiences that you mentioned in your introduction.
As in my Peace Corps experience teaching middle school and or my Norway experience
both.
subbing.
So two different contexts, two different roles that you had. I am curious if some of the challenges, because you're the first person that has spoken to teaching outside of the United States.
Yeah.
I'm curious if some of those same challenges that we see to sustainability are echoed outside of the country.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think both in a lot of ways. I think one thing that I'll highlight as you bring up this question is this tension that we all live in as teachers between classroom management and having the respect of the students and connecting and creating relationships with students so that they are motivated to grow and learn and push themselves. Because I think that that's the part of teaching that sustains me, is having those relationships and seeing those kids lean in and motivate themselves. But it's hard to figure out initially and even later down the line how to walk that line between those two things. And I think that's the first thing that comes to mind for me, because in both of my teaching experiences in West Africa, I was in Burkina Faso, and then in Norway, were both very traditional classroom models. We're talking rows facing forward, ready to listen to teacher, pouring knowledge into head. And I'm sure a lot of people enjoy lecturing at the front of the class and just having students do what they're told to do. And that's an important part of it. But both of those classrooms that I stepped into were already culturally programmed a certain way and kind of programmed in a way that isn't what fills my heart about teaching. So that was really interesting in both of those cases. And I can still remember small anecdotes from both where we had moments where I was able to shift some mindsets of just individuals that they trusted me enough to try a thing or consider adopting a different mindset. And those are the moments that really fill my heart. But it takes time and energy in the long term to kind of create that. So in my Peace Corps classroom, what that meant was I did really silly demos that didn't always land because I didn't really have all that many tools. But eventually students got the idea that this classroom was going to be a little different and they were going to come up front and they were going to do stuff. But then there's always that tension because now you're the different teacher. And now they think that the rules might be off. And maybe the rules of respect and responsibility don't apply anymore. So I feel like walking that line between those two things is a really tricky thing for teachers, and finding your norms that work for you is really important. Face the same thing in substitute teaching because we all kind of hear the stories of like the way the kids act, the way the students act in a classroom with a substitute says more about their real teacher than about the substitute. And I found that to be 100% true in terms of some classes I walked into and chaos. But mostly at the International School in Norway, it was a premier institution that spoke English, really solid classes that it was the opposite. They were so rigidly ready to just do as they were told that I had a hard time getting them to step outside that when I saw something that was a rich opportunity. So that was really interesting to see that difference in the dynamic and the culture.
It makes me wonder because I think of particularly new teachers, and a lot of the challenges, and I know this was the case for me too, early on is just classroom management, right? Can I get them to be quiet long enough for me to teach? It sounds like in both of your experiences, that might not have been an issue because of either culture or the way things were laid out or who you were teaching to. So I think it brings a question to mind for me. If you raise classroom management as a challenge for all teachers, would more teachers stay in the profession? Because I think about what you were saying, right? How lecturing all the time, or maybe even teaching to a lot of really compliant students, in a way was a challenge for you, right? Because, like you said, maybe you went into teaching because you wanted that dynamic group work and experiences and people to take control of the classroom and their learning, whereas you were now in a position where you just had listeners. And so I'm curious, this is obviously all speculative, but I'm curious about your thoughts. Do you think if classroom management was eliminated and we all had classrooms full of compliant 100% of the time students, would more people stay in the profession, or would more people leave because it wouldn't fill their cups?
That's a really great question. I think probably a lot of people would be more willing to stay because of if the classroom management were gone. And I feel like it might give them the bandwidth to actually find their stride in building relationships with students. Because it's tricky walking the line in America where our scales are tipped more towards real challenges in classroom management. And you almost have to build the relationships first before you get any respect and any real solid classroom management. But a lot of teachers aren't prepared to do that. And a lot of teachers aren't prepared to be flexible in adapting how they approach and interact with students. So I do think for a lot of the adults walking into a classroom and haven't been in high school or middle school for so long, it's hard to figure out how to connect So I do think if the classroom management issues could be erased, it might solve some problems, but I think only so because it would help teachers figure out this balance by filling their cup with creating true connections.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think of some of the most engaging lessons that I had, and it's funny, and it probably shouldn't be this way, but I think of the most successful ones as ones where I knew my students who caused trouble a lot, who had behavior issues frequently, when I saw them engaged, I knew like, ooh, this was a good lesson. You know, I was able to get someone who could not care less about what I'm teaching to be engaged for 60 minutes. And again, that probably shouldn't be the metric because that's unfair to all of the other students that are, consistently engaged or maybe engaged and not as demonstrative about it. But there is a reward there that I feel like you wouldn't get as a teacher if everybody was just eyes on you the whole time, every time, no questions about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's for sure a cultural thing, I think, in a lot of ways, because the only other experience that I've had is just vaguely familiar with the education system in Mexico. And there is a lot of that compliance that's kind of just engraved from the start, right? Like the teacher commands respect no matter what. And if there is a problem, the parent isn't going to side with you. Parent's going to listen to the teacher the entire time. And it's quite not the same here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
As we come to a close here, I always like to finish up these episodes by asking my guests if you're in a room with this teacher who is finishing up maybe their first or second year teaching and is thinking about leaving the profession, and you have a few words to share with them, whether it's questions, advice, what is something that you might say to this teacher?
That's a great question. I think the main thing that I would say is you're doing way better than you think. I think that our inner critics are our worst enemies in the first years of teaching. And classroom teaching is messy. And even in I've observed classrooms like across Washington state that all look messy in different ways. And I think to an adult stepping in with a degree in this and that and having worked with adults, you can see that environment and just think, oh my gosh, I'm totally failing. None of this looks neat and tidy and organized. And I think that's what I would really want to hit home is every great teacher in America, their classroom looks messy. And so you're doing great, and just allow yourself to silence your inner critic, or at least quiet them down a little bit.
You did it, Shelley. That teacher's staying in the profession.
Excellent.
Thank you for being generous with your time here and sharing a lot about your experience. I think it will be really helpful to many folks who are listening. And I hope you come back on the podcast in the future.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it and found it helpful to your teaching journey, please don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube or through your favorite podcast platform. We also appreciate any and all reviews or comments you leave. Thank you for joining us today, and tune in next week for our next episode.